Fire and Ice, March 8th, 1995. Dear Fred and Father, well, I know I'm out of the will for sure now. It's been a long time since I've written. Before Christmas, Diane started suggesting that I write to you. She thought we should find out if something had happened to you. I told her that they usually notify the next of kin in those situations. Well, so much has happened that it will be hard to put all the data into one letter. Let's see. We bought a new car, the Bronco 2, as you can see in the pictures I'm sending. Oh, you can keep the photos if you want, or toss them. I ordered doubles, and as you may have noticed, that damn wolf chewed on your copies. The rest of the pictures are from my trip to the Pasapas, or Black Hills for you Cherokees. It was supposed to be a cross-country skiing trip with Evans and Jake, but they both had time conflicts, and I said, to hell with them, and went by myself. I thought I might as well punish myself and take Wolf along with me. Oh, I was right. He was a pain, but he certainly enjoyed himself. We spent 3 nights in a tent together, so he thinks he can do anything now. The trip started like all of my trips seem to start, in chaos and confusion. However, after a long and torturous 12-hour drive from Omaha, Wolf and I finally arrived at the foothills of Custer State Park and viewed the panoramic scene before us. My first thought was, where the hell is the snow? As we all know, I've never been one for planning ahead. I knew that it had been a dry winter around our neck of the woods in Nebraska, but I was hoping for a little bit of white fluffy stuff to scoot around on in South Dakota. I could see immediately that this wasn't the case. Oh well, one must make the best of what one has. That was the way I was raised. So rather than being disappointed, I started making some contingency plans. It was getting dark and I wanted to make camp. I drove a little further into the foothills, found a clearing off the main road and began dumping my gear, ready to pitch the tent. I thought I'd start boiling some water for dinner. Wolf was busy exploring the area, but being a German Shepherd, I wasn't worried that he would venture too far. One of his basic instincts is to shepherd his flock, and I was it. Anyway, I retrieved my little gas camping stove, started it up, put the water on, and proceeded to set up the tent. I swear I only turned my back for a moment. When I spun around, the campsite was ablazing. Imagine that. One of the driest winters on record, and some fool had started the park on fire. Of course, the fool was me. But in my defense, how was I to know that the place was like a tinderbox? I quickly used my Indian heritage and did a powwow dance around the circumference of a 30-yard area. I was able to extinguish the blaze, much to my amazement, and not to mention Wolf's. He was a lot of help, by the way, running around and barking frantically, trying to motivate me into moving a little faster. Somehow I'm sure this was all his fault to begin with, but I can't prove it, and he's not talking. After standing in the burnt circle for quite some time, making sure nothing rekindled, I loaded all my gear back into the Bronco and vacated the area. I certainly didn't want to be there when the park rangers came around asking who was stupid enough to start a fire in these dry conditions. It would be hard to lie your way out of this one when you smell like a pile of burnt leaves, and I didn't think my standard, sorry, I'm from Nebraska, which to be honest has gotten me out of some tight situations in the past, would work either. I was betting at the very least they would have fined me and possibly confiscated everything I had, including Wolf. We drove for quite some distance back into the hills, the whole time checking the rearview mirror for a red glow, of one kind or another, that never appeared. Oh, thank goodness. That first night was cold and dark, and needless to say, dinner was cold too. Since we had traveled all day, Wolf, to put it mildly, was somewhat restless in the tent that night. I couldn't take his rolling around, licking himself and nosing up to me, so I unzipped the tent and left the flap open so he could come and go as he pleased. He spent the entire night checking out the howling coyotes and galloping back and forth, scaring the dog doo-doo out of me. It sounded like a herd of buffalo heading my way every time he came charging back into the tent for a cat nap. And then he'd be off again. I kept wondering when he was going to bring me back a present, dead or alive, but I was too tired to really care. At the first light of day, we packed our gear, found the nearest trailhead parking lot, left the skis in the Bronco, and went for a walk. We hadn't gone very far when we heard enormous grunting noises in the woods. I clipped Wolf up on the long line I had brought with me, and we left the area immediately. I've seen buffalo before at various wildlife parks, and I knew they were nothing we wanted to mess around with. I was also sure they wouldn't take kindly to Wolf invading their territory. For the next 2 days, we hiked back into the hills, but it wasn't long before we started running out of water. I was expecting to use snow, but as you know, skiing turned into hiking, and I only had 2 quarts of water with me. At first, I didn't share my water with Wolf, foolishly thinking that 2 quarts would be enough for me and that Wolf could drink from the streams like his ancestors. We hadn't even trekked through the first day, and I was right there next to him drinking the water out of the streams like my ancestors before me. I know. A person is not supposed to do that, but form follows function, and a thirsty body doesn't care if it picks up a few bugs along the way. By the 3rd night, we headed down into the Narrows, to French Creek, where Custer's men first discovered gold and started the rush. Once we were down the steep face of the Narrows, I wanted to follow the creek back to civilization. But that wasn't going to be easy. It had to be at least another 300 or 400 feet down. Wolf and I made our way, slipping and sliding the entire time, but once there, it was my kind of paradise. Unbelievable scenery, cold and windier than hell, with a beautiful, raging brook that dropped off into the gorge. It was obvious that there was no way out but back the way we had come. I thought about spending the night in the valley, but after an hour of resting and reading the book I had brought along with me, I decided we'd best stick to the high ground. I've always loved a challenge, but this climb, with my 40-pound backpack, was quickly turning into a nightmare. However, when you have no place to go except up, you go up. I went to my knees once, but didn't stop moving until we reached the top. The entire climb, Wolf chased after rocks that were tumbling down like they were loose tennis balls. He enjoyed the game. This whole time I kept thinking that if I ever started rolling downhill with this heavy pack on my back, there would be no stopping. No one would even find the body. My only hope of survival would be Wolf. I chuckled to myself at that thought. I was remembering how Lassie always went for help and saved the day in those TV shows of my youth. Wolf, on the other hand, would most likely just sit obediently next to my rotting carcass and wait for his dinner. We made it out and spent the last night stargazing. The weather was great the entire trip, maybe 27 degrees at night. The next morning we headed out, and I was glad that we hadn't run into any serious wild game. I had packed my dog training whip, and anytime Wolf took off after elk or deer, I'd crack it, he would stop in his tracks and come running back. As we worked our way along the top of the Narrows, I spied what I thought were some deer in a clearing. Wolf hadn't spotted them yet, so I grabbed his leash and kept walking down a path that led east out of the hills. As it turned out, what I thought were deer were actually a dozen bighorn sheep that populate the high country. I snapped a picture and kept walking toward the herd, expecting them to run away. Wolf and I were within 20 yards of their grazing area, and the whole time I was thinking, boy, these animals are tame. A split second later, they all turned in unison, lined up shoulder to shoulder, heads down, and charged at us. Instinctively, I cracked my whip and hollered out, "Wolf!" to get his attention on me and not on the sheep. Now, it may have been a coincidence that I had a dog resembling his name, or fool's luck, but warning the sheep that I was armed with a wolf and a whip must have stunned them as they veered to the right, stopped, and then, rather arrogantly, simply started milling about. We, on the other hand, made a sheepish withdrawal. There was no doubt in my mind that we had just narrowly missed being stomped to death. Perhaps that's how the Narrows got its name in the first place. Working our way out of the hills, I couldn't seem to find a decent path leading back to the trailhead where I had parked the Bronco at the start of this expedition. I suppose a person could take a map to know exactly where they are going and where they have been, but I have always relied on my Indian heritage. And when that fails, as it usually does, I have learned to enjoy the thrill of being lost. But as they say, it's hard to be lost if you don't care where you are. And somehow, being in the bowels of Mother Earth, it's hard to leave the womb. Wolf and I were following the top ridge along the eastern range when I viewed a promising trail near a creek in the valley below. I didn't want to lose the vertical elevation because the view of the open prairie rushing to meet the foothills was dynamic, to say the least. But I finally decided that maybe we should head down toward the creek. Unfortunately, once we were there, I saw that it was only a horse trail on the other side of the ice-edged stream. I spotted what at first appeared to be a log crossing the creek, but it turned out to be an old, rusty, elevated waterline pipe about a foot wide. I felt sure that I could tightrope across it, but I wasn't sure if Wolf would try to follow me on the pipe, and if he did, I knew he would try to charge past me. He's not fond of following, even if he doesn't know where he's going. Perhaps dogs do take on the personality of their master. I didn't really like the idea of being knocked off the pipe and falling 20 feet, carrying a 40-pound pack, so we bashed through the underbrush until we found a large fallen tree closer to the ground to cross the rushing water. A few hundred yards downstream, though, we had to cross the creek again, where the water met up with a canyon wall. We forged that damn creek at least 3 or 4 times. I'm sure it was nothing to the horses that the trail was designed for, but it was always a challenge for Wolf and me. Well, more me than him. Cold and wet, our journey to the lower hills was completed, and it wasn't long before we came to the open expanse of a snowless valley below. Along the way, I kept watching the raging rapids for a calm pool of water to bathe in. I felt, for some strange reason, that I had to go fatty dipping in that creek to make the adventure official. I physically am unable to go skinny dipping. I found a backed water area behind one of the many beaver dams that littered the stream in the lower foothills, and stripped. It was time for a cleansing. Just before I was ready to enter the water, I saw 4 buffalo wandering slowly out of the woods across the meadow just south of us. There I was, stark naked, with my little whip as my only defense. I decided I was going to go dipping no matter what, so keeping a watchful eye on the small herd, I broke the half-inch ice off the edge of the stream in sheets and sent them floating away with the current. I found a deep spot, told myself that Fred wouldn't consider it official unless I got my head wet, and plunged in. I must admit, I also plunged out, wide awake, and raced towards my clothes with that damn dog chasing me down, thinking this must be some sort of a new game. The buffalo kept coming our way, but as I stood there drying in the wind, I could judge their movement. It would be some time before they reached us. I had no real desire to whip my way through a stampeding herd of angry buffalo, but I was somewhat frozen to the spot, so to speak. There was an eerie silence in this magical world of buffalo, man, and dog. I would like to find the words to describe it, but, for the most part, only children and animals understand magic. I spent some time scoping them with my binoculars while Wolf was basking in the sunshine, oblivious to their presence. As they drifted our way, I dressed, said thank you, and left them to their domain. And then it was over. I had explored about 20 miles of the Pasapas and somehow ended up right back at the Bronco. A full circle, if you will. Perhaps finding it was the Indian blood, but then again, I think the people who know me would lean towards the fool's luck part of the equation. Any way you look at it, it was a trip to remember. I hope you enjoy the pictures. Well, I'd best sign off. I have to work for a living now and start saving some money for Taylor's college education. Courtney and Diane are looking forward to our trip to Texas in about a week. Court wants to learn how to rope and ride horses while we're down there. Diane just wants to travel, and Taylor just wants to drive the whole way. Take care. Jeffrey.